Hello, good morning everyone, or good afternoon for some of you. We are about ready to start, so just a couple of housekeeping items to begin with. My name is Kelly Mylink, and I'm a member of Husch Blackwell's Labor and Employment Law Group and leader of our Immigration and Global Mobility Practice team. We are excited to be talking with you today about the changes to this upcoming H-1B CAP season and talk about the changes that you need to know about. Before we begin, there's a couple of things you need to know. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. I would like to take a minute just to highlight a few key icons for you. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit your question via the question box. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. We truly appreciate audience participation, so we encourage you to submit your questions and we'll answer as many as we can and answer those we cannot later. There's also an icon to assist with your viewing preferences. Accordingly, please note that you can expand your slide area by clicking on the maximize icon on the top right of the slide area or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide area. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the help icon. It has a question mark and provides information regarding common technical issues. A copy of today's slide deck and additional materials are available in the resource list icon that looks like a folder at the bottom of your screen. This program has been approved for continuing legal education credit in Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Tennessee, and Texas. Wisconsin credit is currently pending. To report your hours in Illinois, Nebraska, Texas, or Tennessee, click on the CLE widget at the bottom of your screen and complete the questions. Additionally, this program is also approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. A recording of this webcast will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing. Once available, a link to the recording will be emailed to you along with a certificate of attendance. So joining me today is my colleague Christine Fabin. She is also a member of our Immigration and Global Mobility Practice team, and we'll be talking to you together. So let's get started. Today we're going to cover a lot of topics about the H-1B CAP season, or the H-1B lottery as it's sometimes known. We're going to introduce and do a brief introduction to what an H-1B visa is, sort of talk about the very basics, briefly cover those before getting into some of the changes to this new H-1B CAP or lottery happening this fiscal year. And that includes talking about this new H-1B registration period, explaining what that is and what the new filing procedures are to make sure that any H-1B petitions or registrations are accepted this year. We'll talk about pre-registration preparation strategies, how employers should be thinking about preparing for that this year, and common then switching gears to common requests for evidence from USCIS, so sort of what happens on the back end. Once the petition is filed and processing, and is selected for processing, what are the things that USCIS is asking for this year? What kinds of evidence are they really looking for, and some tricks along the way. Finally, we'll wrap up by talking about some other considerations in the H-1B sponsorship process, sort of a more general things to be thinking about in the back of your mind if you are, as an employer, are considering sponsoring employees for this process. But because we have CLE credit that requires us to have poll questions, we are starting off with a poll question right off the bat. Christine and I are in Kansas City, and we would be remiss to say if we did not mention that we are Chiefs fans here. So we're not saying we're going to kick you off the webinar if you're a 49ers fan. I'm just kidding. But we do have to have some poll questions, so we thought we'd ask you what team you're rooting for in the Super Bowl and kick us off that way before we take a deeper dive into what an H-1B visa is, and I kick this over to Christine. Okay, well, it looks like we have a lot of local people, or maybe you're just humoring us here in Kansas City because that's where we're based. But we do appreciate it here. It's an exciting time for our city, but it was a fun Sunday. All right, back to business. Okay, Christine, why don't you take us through an introduction of the H-1B visa?
Sure, thanks, Kelly. So to get started, I would like to have a better understanding of who our audience is and their involvement with H-1Bs in the past. So another poll question, has your organization filed an H-1B petition in the lottery in the past? And if you guys could submit those just so that we, have an idea as to who we're talking to.
We know we've got some beginners in the audience and some individuals who might be very, very familiar with the H-1B process, but it's good to know.
All right. So we have a good combination of yes, no's, or not sure. So we'll try to make sure to tailor our presentation to those of you who have a lot of experience and try to give a bit more background for those of you that maybe don't. So the H-1B is by far the most common employer-sponsored work authorization. I often like to start by telling people its purpose, which means that we have to take a couple steps back, and you have to bear with me for just a little bit. So the federal government thinks it's very, very important that foreign nationals are not taking the jobs of U.S. workers. The most common way to be able to prove that to the government is through a really long, expensive process called the labor cert process, and that's a different webinar for a different day. So when the regulations were being drawn up, the business community basically went to the government, from my understanding, and said, hey, government, we get that you don't want foreign nationals taking the job of U.S. workers, but this process is really long and expensive, and we don't know if we want to actually invest in our foreign national employees yet. So give us some time where our foreign national employee can work for us, and before their time is up, we'll make a decision. So hence, the H-1B was born. The H-1B visa allows foreign national employees to work for an employer for up to 6 years, but before that 6 years is up, if the employer wants to continue employing the foreign national, the employer then has to go through this process where they test the labor market and prove to the U.S. government that there is no willing and qualified U.S. worker for the position. All of our H-1B visas are specialty occupation visas. This means that the position requires at least a bachelor's degree, and that the foreign national has the degree that's being required. So I think that the most common, or an easy example would be a mathematics professor. Obviously, if you're recruiting for a mathematics professor, you're going to have or require a bachelor's degree in mathematics. And for someone to be qualified for the position, they're going to have obtained that degree prior to applying for the job. So that brings us then to the H-1B visa lottery. Every year, there are about 85,000 new H-1B visas available. 20,000 of those are reserved for individuals who hold a master's degree or higher from an accredited U.S. institution. Because there are way more applicants who want an H-1B than there are visas, I think, Kelly, last year it was, 200,000 people who were wanting an H-1B. A random computer-generated lottery occurs every April 1st. So those lucky enough to be selected are then processed by USCIS. Historically, there's about a 38% chance of selection. I would say that we're forecasting a lower percentage this year because we're expecting to see a pretty high number of applications. Also, just a side note, for you colleges and universities that are on the call, you are exempt. There are exceptions for colleges and universities, so your employees don't have to go through this lottery. But keep in mind throughout this webinar that a vast majority of your foreign national students that are applying to jobs in the traditional workforce are going to have to, kind of go combat this lottery this upcoming year. All right, so just to give you a visual for the steps we take when filing an H-1B, we created this handy little chart. The chart doesn't really take into account the nuances of the lottery. It's more so just a general picture of the most important steps in the H-1B process. And we'll come back to this later on, but I'm just going to run you through these 4 steps before we move on to our next portion. So the first part of an H-1B on our end of things is that we do our due diligence. We're going to gather all of the information from the employee, all of their documents, their passports, their immigration information, and then we're also going to get information from you, the employers, as to, the job description, the requirements, the salary being offered. On our end, we do some spot checking, make sure that there aren't any issues or red flags. We also look at things like the prevailing wage to make sure that our job description and requirements are going to meet what the Department of Labor has said is the minimum that we must pay our employee. Assuming that everything looks okay, we'll move on to the next step, which is preparing and filing the labor condition application, posting the workplace notices, and preparing the public access files. So this portion of the H-1B process is really regulated by the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor gives us all of these different rules that we have to abide by in filing an H-1B. One of those things is that we have to draft a labor condition application. You'll hear us refer to it as an LCA. And the LCA basically is our filing to the Department of Labor, where we ask the Department of Labor to certify that the wage that we're going to pay our foreign national is compliant with the law. Along with that labor condition application, we also have our employers post a public notice at the worksite location, and then also prepare a public access file that's required for our employers to be in compliance with the law. This portion of it takes roughly 5 to 10 days, and there's not really any getting around it because that's just how long it takes the Department of Labor to certify these LCAs. The LCA is needed for us, a certified LCA is needed when we go and submit our H-1Bs. So, it's just a necessary part of the petition. Once we receive the certified LCA, and kind of in conjunction with the LCA, we then start preparing our H-1B for filing. So that means, all of the forms, all of the letters, the exhibits and the evidence that we're including with our petition. We prepare all of that, we bind it, and once that's done and the forms are signed, we send it off to immigration for either approval, denial, or sometimes, a lot of the times these days, a request for evidence. That in and of itself, those 4 pieces are kind of the life cycle of an H-1B. And again, this might kind of seem out of place now, but we will come back to this later on. I guess before I give it to Kelly, Kelly, I have a joke for you.
This is Christine's habit. She has to surprise me with a joke during every webinar that we do together. Go ahead, Christine.
I can't help it. Okay, so why did the pig buy a lottery ticket?
I don't know.
He wanted to be filthy rich. Oh. Sorry. All right, so on to Kelly.
Thanks, Christine.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what the lottery or H-1B cap process looks like now and what this new registration period looks like. So I want to start by looking at what we did last year, essentially. So in years past, as Christine said, the demand for H-1B visas has greatly exceeded the supply. We're well over that 85,000. Certainly in years past, we didn't reach the 85,000 mark, but that's been so long ago that the demand is really, really off the charts now. So in the past, the regulations told us that we could submit our applications for consideration in that fiscal year's 85,000 6 months in advance of the start date of that fiscal year, April 1. The government runs on a fiscal year cycle starting October 1, 180 days before that would be, or 6 months before that would be April 1. So what we have done in the past is we've essentially put together the entire H-1B petition up front. We filed that labor condition application. We posted those workplace notices. We completed the public access file that contained the Department of Labor's required information related to the wage and working conditions of that position. Then we filed, we call it filed, but we submitted the H-1B petition with all of that information that's complete, robust, on April 1st. And it's really, it opens up it opened up the filing period, usually a week or 5 days. So employers had sort of this 5 days to get their H-1B petitions to be considered in this lottery process. And remember too, and I'm not sure probably I should have said this up front, but the lottery is just for those individuals who are seeking H-1B status as a first time. This process that we're talking about does not apply to anyone who already has an H-1B in hand. So if you're hiring an employee who already has an H-1B, generally speaking, you're not going to have to go through this process again. Because that employee has already undertaken this cap process. They've already been counted against that number for some year in the past. Generally, there are all sorts of caveats, but we'll leave it at that. So this is just for those individuals who are generally going from, for example, a student visa to an H-1B. And so they needed to get counted in this 85,000. And so employers would prepare the entire H-1B petition. We'd submit it that first week of April or April 1st in the next 5 business days. And USCIS, or U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, would conduct the random computer-generated lottery, select which petitions would be processed. They'd hold on to those physical petitions that we submitted, and they'd process them. We wouldn't find out that the petition was selected unless we received a receipt notice in the mail. We'd get that receipt notice in the mail, and we'd know that USCIS was processing that petition. And that usually happened May, sometimes June, and then usually June, but gosh, in last year I think we were getting petitions out until July. We would get the H-1B petition back if it wasn't selected in that lottery. So it really took a long time for employers and their employees, or those who they intended to sponsor, a long time to get those petitions back into their hands. So we're looking at this process, and USCIS kind of said, you know what, this really isn't feasible. I mean, we're getting 200,000 H-1B petitions all at once on this first week. We're having to sort through physical petitions, and there's got to be a more workable way. So over a year ago, USCIS released sort of proposed regulations saying, we need to adjust this process, sort of bring it up to date, and figure out a better way. And, you know, part of the problem for this process for employers, too, is that employers are responsible for paying the costs and fees, including legal fees, including those government filing fees, for anything related to the preparation and filing of an H-1B petition. It's not a cost that employers are allowed or permitted to pass on to the employee, and that's sort of a Department of Labor regulation. So this, it's a hefty process for an employer to go through for an employee, knowing that you might have less than a 40% chance of getting selected in this lottery, and sometimes less than that, right? So this process is still sort of a burden on employers to go through, not knowing if the petition is going to be selected. And having an employee who likely has work authorization through their student visa or through something else is going to end soon. So really needing this work authorization, H-1B work authorization on behalf of an employee, but not having the ability to get it. So USCIS said, well, nothing we can do about the numbers, so let's sort of bring this process and try to, bring it into the 21st century a little bit here. So USCIS, about a year and a half ago, issued proposed regulations saying we're going to implement a registration process. And this registration process is not going to require employers to put together this entire H-1B petition up front. And instead, employers will just have to fill out an online form. We'll conduct a random lottery electronically through this online form or online registration, and then those petitions that are selected, or those cases that are selected, will then submit an H-1B petition on behalf of the sponsored employee. So essentially, putting off having to compile the H-1B petition until after the lottery is conducted. Sounds great in theory. In practice, we still don't know a whole lot about the process. We know that, so what I'm going to tell you today is what we know about the process now. There is still a lot of unknowns, and when we set this webinar, we were hoping to do it in January, but we thought, oh, you know what, we may not have all of the details by January, let's push this off till February. Well, let me tell you, we are now sitting in February, and we still don't know a lot about this process. We can't log in to see the registration. We don't actually know just some of the fine-tuned details about this process, and it's coming up very quickly. So what we intend to do is tell you what we know, but know that in the next few weeks we are expecting and are told more information from USCIS is coming. But essentially this new process involves sort of this extra registration step. And as part of this, all employers who want to register have to pay this $10 fee per registration, so $10 fee per employee registration. So if you're an employer, you intend to sponsor 4 employees through the H-1B lottery, $40. So we know we have to pay a $10 fee, and that's sort of the first process. And actually what ends up happening is you start your registration process. So you're filling out your registration, and that's done through this website that's already in existence, myuscis.gov. And that website's already used for lots of other different electronic forms, but that's the website that will be used. And employers would create an account, employers or their legal representatives would create an account on this myuscis.gov website, and then they will create a separate registration for each employee that is going to be sponsored. And when you put all of those employee names in that registration, it'll pop out and it'll say, oh, you intend to sponsor 4 employees, that's a $40 fee. You're redirected to pay.gov where you will pay $40. How that is actually going to implement in practice, I mean, it sounds very simple. We actually don't know.
I have no idea.
We don't know how we're going to tell the registration that we've paid the $10 fee, but hopefully that information's going to be coming from USCIS soon. The registration information required is actually not that extensive. From the employer, it appears that what the employer is going to have to put in or input into this registration is the legal name of the sponsoring organization, the sponsoring employer, if they have any doing business as names, their FEIN, their employer identification numbers. Employers will have to include their primary U.S. office address and a contact person. That contact person is actually really important, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Then for each individual who will be sponsored, that individual, those employees or those individuals who the employer intends on sponsoring, all that is required is that person's legal name, their gender, their date of birth, if that person has a master's degree from a U.S. institution, or a master's or higher degree, so a PhD would also count, from a U.S. institution of higher education. So remember, there's 20,000 H-1B visas reserved just for individuals with U.S. master's degrees. So that is why we have to answer yes or no. The individual's country of birth, their country of citizenship, and their passport number. It is very slim on the information that employers and their representatives have to include on this registration. That registration goes into this electronic system through myuscis.gov, and at the current moment, so the regulations say it's like a 14-day period that USCIS will accept these registrations. This year, that registration period is March 1st through March 20th, where employers can fill out their registrations, pay their fee, and submit it to be considered for the lottery. USCIS will then conduct that computer-generated lottery. They have indicated on their website that that will be held on or before March 31st, or at least that's when they intend to notify employers that whether or not their registration has been selected for essentially to move forward with an H-1B petition. Employers will be notified electronically, or they can log back into their account. Employers or their representatives can log back into their account and find out. So that it's a very quick process. It's coming up very quickly. If an employer has a case that is a registration that is selected in this lottery and they're notified, that employer has 90 days after the date of selection, so ideally the 90-day count would start, not April 1st, to submit the actual H-1B filing. So that includes that certified LCA that Christine was talking about. All of the H-1B petition forms and all of the supporting documents would then be physically filed within that 90 days after selection. So essentially moving the paper part of the process after the lottery is conducted. And then USCIS will process those H-1B petitions and issue a decision, or they might request additional evidence. So in practice, when you're thinking about this, you're thinking, oh yeah, this seems really easy. We can, this seems very logical to have a process that works this way. But again, we can't log in to see, right now we can't log into my USCIS to see the registration form. USCIS has indicated that we'll be able to fill it out in advance, but it's not up yet. Pay.gov doesn't have any information about how to pay that $10 fee or how to link it to that registration. So there's all sorts of things that we just don't know. Other than we've seen some screenshots of what the system will look like, and it seems pretty simple, so we're hoping that it all works smoothly. But as we'll talk about, anything can go wrong, particularly with a new system. So we know that, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, has implemented new procedures in the past. They have been pretty responsive, but this is a huge undertaking for this agency to do. This is a pretty big undertaking for the agency, and particularly a very short time window. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Some of the considerations, and I'm sorry the text on the left is really tiny. We were trying to get it all on the slide, but I'll explain it here in a second. Some considerations is that employers and their representatives will need to create a My USCIS online account, and we have a link to that website at the end of this webinar. The account that employers will create, or their representatives, they can create multiple registrations under that. So employers who are sponsoring multiple employees, they'll create one account and they can create different registrations for different employees. There is an employer attestation, and that's what's on the left. And the important thing about this attestation is whoever is clicking submit or submitting any information to this account is doing so on behalf of the employer and they are certifying that they are authorized to do that on behalf of the employer. They are certifying under penalty of perjury that the information is correct. Why I point this out is because what we see in practice in some other immigration areas is that you might be HR, you might be legal, or you might be a manager, but there are often rogue managers or rogue people within the organization who says, oh, all I have to do is fill out an I-9 form for you, employee Joe. Sure, I'll fill that out. And the requisite people within the organization doesn't know that information is being submitted to the government on their behalf. So it's important to understand that attestation is there, and that when the employer clicks, they are making certain representations on behalf of the organization. So I point that out because it also becomes important for what's called a two-factor authentication. So if you are an employer and you say, you know what, I can't handle this process, and really I'll tell you, it's very complicated, and you say, we have legal counsel who does this, we have outside immigration counsel who handles this for us. I can understand the gist of this process, but I want my legal counsel to create the account, to fill out the information, and handle this process on our behalf, or you have an immigration specialist on your team. Well, if you're using outside legal counsel, then they are creating the account on your behalf, or creating an account that they will submit things on your behalf. There is a two-factor authentication, meaning you can't just say, outside legal counsel, please fill this out. The system will generate a form saying somebody from the employer still has to attest that this person is acting on your behalf. What we don't know is how that will actually work. We know that the two-factor authentication generally means, you fill out a password and then you get a text message with a code that you then put into the account. So you probably do that with your bank accounts. But how we're going to get the information and how soon, so if I am the for example, I am the legal representative for Company A, and I'm filling this information out for Company A. I click submit. An email goes to the employer, my client, to confirm that the information is correct and that I'm acting on their behalf. How soon they would have to respond by completing that two-factor authentication process, go in, log in, fill out their information, or fill out their password, or whether or not they're going to get a text message saying, please input this code. We don't know. So that's kind of part of this sort of question about this process. I mean, it's easy enough if you create your own account and you're doing a two-factor authentication where you're having to do a second password or input a code from yourself from a text message. It comes a little more complicated when the employer has a representative. I think all of that information will sort itself out very, very quickly in the next few weeks, but that is, again, another one of those unknowns about this process. Same goes with the attorney entry of appearances. If you are hiring or you have outside legal counsel who will enter your appearance and do this process on your behalf, there is a online G-28 form entry of appearance that has to be filled out in advance of this process, which is also not available yet. So there is sort of an extra step too to get that as part of this. So we're again waiting for that information to come out, but we'll know that it's part of the process. And so employers who want to hand off all of this process to outside legal counsel might find themselves sort of back in the middle of this process, having to sort of verify information and clicking and putting in additional codes to confirm filing. The other issue we already talked about was how to link payment to registration, that $10 payment, which is done on the pay.gov website, to the registration. Again, I wish we were at a point with this webinar schedule that we would have all this information to share. We expected to have it, and we don't. Hopefully, and we expect that information is coming out in the next 2 weeks. And then finally, the slowness of any government system. We know this is a new system, sort of a new, my USCIS, of course, has been around for a while, but it's probably not used to this much traffic on that website. I know that a lot of the concerns in the immigration community are what happens if it just shuts down. If you are an employer who filed in the H-2B, which is low-skilled, temporary, non-agricultural workers, that system failed one year, and it was just completely unexpected, and we had to sort of regroup, as we in the moment for that. So it certainly could happen that the system would just fail because of the high traffic. I mean, the best advice I can give is to the extent registrations can be filed in the middle of the night when there's lower website traffic. We've tried that approach on other websites when we know traffic is an issue. Also, certainly early mornings, not during business hours, can be a nice tip there. Finally, and this isn't a bullet point on this website, but I do want to mention that premium processing, which is an expedited processing option for employers. Premium processing allows for employers to speed up the processing of an H-1B petition after it is filed to 15 calendar days, And otherwise, regular processing of an H-1B petition is, 8 to 10 months these days. It's really long. A lot of employers then want to just say, we'll pay the additional government filing fee, which at these days is $1,440, to speed up the processing of the petition. And that may be suspended this year. It is generally that expedited processing option to pay for the expedited processing for H-1B petitions is often suspended during this process. So keep in mind that if that's something that your employee is asking for, it just might not be available for certain times, or it might be. We don't know. That just usually happens during this time. So we don't quite know the answer to that question yet. Okay, so knowing that we don't have all the answers, Christine, how do we even prepare for this process?
I know, right? So it is the Wild West of immigration right now. For those of you who have been around for a while, you know that things have been changing pretty substantially. So we're figuring that out as things change, and we appreciate that you guys are patient and figuring it out with us too. So really, in the immigration world, there's a lot of buzz about this new registration system. There are a lot of attorneys that are preparing for the registration differently. Kelly and I have kind of gone back and forth. A lot of our colleagues are pretty staunch on, what their approach is going to be. We kind of landed on educating our clients and then letting our clients make the decision. I was in-house for a while, and so, I definitely get wanting to be educated and wanting to have a voice in the decision-making process. And I think Kelly and I we're pretty adamant that our clients know their options, and then we can make that decision together. So I'm actually going to work backwards on this. Today I was looking through this slide and thought it might make more sense. So let's start with the due diligence analysis only. So remember this little slide that we talked about earlier? So due diligence analysis only would put us in the gray. So with the due diligence analysis only, we would be gathering all of the information about the employee, gathering information on the job description, requirements, spot checking for any potential issues, whether it be with the employee's immigration history or wage issues, and then we would prepare the registration and we'd submit it. In essence, this would be, it would be the least amount of time and honestly pretty cheap up front. The only concern with the due diligence due diligence analysis only, is that no forms or filings would be prepared. So in the event that my USCIS system did go belly up and immigration, decides that they want us to file everything via paper, it puts us at risk. One, of not being able to submit everything on time, but then also two, just not having enough time to compile everything, get it filed with the Department of Labor, and then filed with immigration. The second most common way that we're seeing individuals prepare for this registration is completing the due diligence, the LCA, and the public access file. So that then would put us at the first, we would complete the first two. So we do our due diligence, compile all of the documents, make sure there are no issues, and then we would prepare and file the LCA with the Department of Labor, as well as get that public notice up and posted. Honestly, this is probably my favorite option. The problem with the paper filing, going back to a lot of individuals being really concerned about USCIS going belly up and requiring us to submit paper forms, the problem in terms of the timeline is that this LCA puts us at least 5 to 10 days back. Because if you remember, that's how long it usually takes for the Department of Labor to issue a certified LCA. If we then approach the pre-registration period by both doing the due diligence and getting the LCA on file, granted, it's a bit more expensive, but you kind of mitigate the risks, I think, a substantial amount, because if nothing else, you at least have that 5-day wait behind you. So that's the second option. The third option then is this completion of the entire H-1B petition. This is, I would say, the most, in my experience, and Kelly, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but everyone that I've talked to in terms of immigration attorneys that are really staunch on how they're moving forward with preparing for registration, everyone that I've spoken to is going to complete the entire H-1B petition. So that means, yeah, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the entire process. Go ahead.
Right. So that means everything from start to the first 3 boxes, just short of the red box, everything is being done. Again, given that this is, the first year where the electronic system is being implemented, there are risks. But this, from what I've heard, is, it's just going to be expensive. It's going to be the normal cost of an H-1B plus additional costs for the registration system, the registration filing. That all has to be paid up front without knowing whether or not your employee was selected in the lottery. Granted, I think for a lot of our very risk-adverse clients, this is a great option because as soon as something happens that isn't what immigration has planned for, like the system going belly up, we can submit, and there's not going to be any sort of wait. But again, with my in-house cap on, it makes me a little uncomfortable to pay so much for something that I don't necessarily feel is needed. But again, I think the vast majority of immigration attorneys would probably disagree with me.
Yeah, and I'm on the same page. We've talked about this at length, that it's really a thing. You have to think about it as sort of mitigating risk. What's the risk that the whole system is just going to crash, and everything is gonna have to be paper filing to the old way where we file paper, and that whole registration process is just gonna go out the window. And what's the risk that USCIS doesn't give employers that time to put together the H-1B, the LCA and the H-1B petition in paper? I don't know with that. It's kind of hard. I would think that it's a lower risk, but it's hard to tell. Some of this comes from a lot of distrust and mistrust in the agency to really be friendly to employers during this process, and not to just say, well, sorry, this happened, now this is the way it's going to be. So I think there's that sentiment out there that's sort of driving this, hey, let's just do the whole thing, and then we'll complete the registration and we'll just be ready in case all of our cases are going to be selected. But I think also as the employer, you have to think about, if this registration works, I mean, you're going to have likely, and I think it's expected, likely more than 200,000 registrations completed this year for 85,000 visas, right? So the chances of selection, in my opinion, and what I'm hearing, are going to be significantly lower than what they have been in years past. I could be proven wrong. Anything could happen this year, but that's sort of my feeling on this. So that's, I mean, I think where we have definitely landed is sort of that green column, that, you know, at least let's get some of this done, make sure we're at least prepared, because that labor condition application does take a week. But certainly if you don't do that, you know, and you just do the due diligence analysis only, you'll be in good shape if it all works out. So it really is just sort of your appetite for risk, and how you feel about this process.
All right, so I guess that being said, we've got another survey question. So tell us your thoughts. I mean, what do you guys think is the best way to prepare for registration? Do a lot of you just hate surprises and want to complete the entire H-1B? Do you agree with us that the LCA public access file due diligence sounds reasonable? Or do you just want the due diligence and you're okay with the risk? Let us know your thoughts.
Or maybe we've just confused you, and you're like, I can't. We were really worried about this because we confuse ourselves when talking to ourselves about this process. We're like, wait, but what if we did it this way?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I think this is kind of a rough breakdown of what we expected, and good to know. Yeah, so those of you who work with us, this will be a conversation that we have with you individually. Those of you who have other outside counsel, just know that there are options, and you know, that's something that you can discuss with your immigration counsel moving forward.
Okay. Oh, we have another poll question. We had to get them all in.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so tell us what are your general thoughts on the new H-1B lottery process? Do you love it? Do you like that we get to do this registration up front? Cautiously optimistic. Those of you might think that it's not going to work well at all, and then also holding my opinion until after this year's registration process.
While you answer that, I want to take care of a couple of questions. Some of you have asked about the cost of an H-1B. I'll tell you the government filing fees. Obviously, every different immigration attorney is going to charge something a little different, usually within a range. But for the registration process, it's only $10, and whatever it would be for your outside immigration counsel to put it together, assuming you're using an outside immigration counsel. If it's selected in the lottery, the filing fees are $460. There's a $500 fraud fee. And then there is an additional fee, ACWIA, what does it stand for? American Competitive, well, it's additional fee, $1,500 if you have more than 25 employees, and if you have less than 25 employees, it's $750. So all told, you could be looking at filing fees of $2,500 around that. We had a couple of questions about expedited processing as well. Assuming premium processing is going to be available, you can't select premium processing until the H-1B is filed. So you can, assuming your registration is selected in this process, and then you submit your H-1B petition, you could either submit that petition with expedited processing request, or at any time during the processing you could submit the expedited processing request. Assuming that expedited processing or that premium processing, it means the same thing, is available. So I knew we had a couple of questions out there that I wanted to make sure we covered. I had some pretty good questions about cap gap. Cap gap applies once the individual knows that they have been selected in the registration process. So cap gap is this extension of OPT, or optional practical training work authorization, through the employee's student visa. In a lot of cases, that work authorization might expire, for example, in June 1. If that person has expiring work authorization in June 1 through their student visa on June 1, once they know they have been selected in this process and their H-1B petition is on file and processing, cap gap at that point in time would apply. So that's a consideration that you need to keep in mind here, what those expiration dates are of your employee's student visa employment work authorization, because that cap gap is going to become tricky because you have that 90-day filing window. So my anticipation is that cap gap doesn't apply until the H-1B petition is on file. I mean, of course, we don't have any guidance on that, but that is how I would read and understand the regs. So take that with a grain of salt, but be in constant contact with your immigration experts. So, we're getting in a lot of questions. I'm going to move on or show you the poll results. Sorry, Christine, to interrupt you here.
No. All right. Cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I think we're in the same boat. we're hoping that it works, but it's change is sometimes good, and just sometimes too much change is too much. All right. So we'll keep trying to answer your questions, but know that we have a lot coming in, so we might not be able to get to all of them. Let's talk post-H-1B processing. So we're getting through, let's put the registration process aside. Your petition, you found out you were selected in the lottery through the registration process. You submitted your H-1B petition. Great. And this applies to any H-1B petition, right? You submit your H-1B petition, you could either get approved, denied, or USCIS could issue this request for additional evidence. These are incredibly common. These requests, we want more evidence about certain issues or parts of the process. So one of these common things that USCIS asks for is whether or not the actual position that you are sponsoring the worker for meets the definition of specialty occupation. So if you go back to that original definition, to qualify for an H-1B petition, the position itself has to require a bachelor's degree in a specific field of study. And what USCIS says a lot of times is, yeah, we'll agree with you that a bachelor's degree is required, but tell us why you need a bachelor's degree in engineering. Why couldn't somebody with a different type of degree qualify for this position? Or they could also say, we don't think a bachelor's degree at all is required for this position. We see those a lot. They are pretty substantial to respond to. They require things like an expert, often some of the evidence that they'll ask for are expert letters, so some outside independent expert saying, oh, come on, you can look at these job duties and see that this position is requiring a degree in a specific field. This is a mechanical engineering position. It requires a mechanical engineering degree. Duh. Essentially. So those expert letters are sometimes things that we respond to. We provide detailed job duties charts, lots of work product. There are lots of types of evidence that we have to submit in response to that because it becomes a very substantial response, and a lot of evidence goes into that. And it's very common. some of those common issues occurs with positions that are marketing positions are a common target, civil engineering is a common target, IT-related positions are always a target for these requests for evidence. It was not unusual to get a request for evidence. They're asking for student visa records quite often. They're making sure that the student or the employee who is on a student visa is maintaining their student visa status, and by being employed in the job that they listed on their student visa application. So they're essentially going back through the employee's immigration history to ensure they maintained immigration status. They are asking for evidence that there is an actual employee-employer relationship between the sponsoring employer and the employee. And you would think that, oh, of course, like, why would they issue that? But you'd be surprised. We've seen those on just, for large organizations where we say, well, we employ 75 other software engineers, and they are all employees. Why would we treat this person any differently? So it happens. It's quite frequent. And then third-party work sites, I mean, that's 3 more webinars long to discuss the issues with third-party work sites. But know that if you are an employer who wants to sponsor employees for an H-1B status, and you are putting the employee at a third-party work site for all or part of their employment, talk to a specialist. Talk to an immigration lawyer if you don't have one on staff who understands these issues, because they are quite complicated. Finally, some other considerations. For the most part, there's some exceptions to this. We advise employers to tell, it says an H-1B worker, but H-1B applicant or an H-1B beneficiary, your employee who's being sponsored for H-1B status, not to travel internationally. Once they've got the H-1B, you're fine. But once before they have it, during that petition process, generally don't travel. We advise not to travel internationally. There are some caveats to that. So if you have an employee who needs to travel or something, talk to your immigration counsel about that. Employers and employees should be keeping track of work authorization expiration dates. That goes back to that gap question. So you understand when their work authorization expires, when the H-1B petition could be approved, so you're avoiding those gaps in work authorization. And then, what happens if the case is not selected? And we talk about these every year, but there's just not a whole lot of options. I mean, this is the work authorization visa, the most common types, and often there's just not other options available. There might be, but those are conversations to have with immigration counsel to sort of explore those options. We have just a few minutes left. Maybe we can get through a few more questions. But there is a list of resources on your screen, so hopefully that helps a little bit.
All right, Kelly. So are you saying that if the USCIS website were to crash, they would require us to file a complete H-1B petition as a backup plan?
We don't know.
That's
know. Speculation.
That is what the immigration community really thinks. All of the conversations we've had, the immigration community has been like, well, if the website were to crash, they're going to require us to file a complete H-1B petition. Honestly, I don't know how they would require us to do that, but that's the discussion that's happening right now.
Yeah, the registration process is now in the regulation, so you'd have to set a new regulation, and I don't know how they could.
Yeah, but
who knows?
Who knows?
This is a good one. Is there a discussion happening about what happens if someone is selected and doesn't follow through? Meaning, if someone is selected in the registration process, the employer submits a registration, that registration on behalf of that employee is selected, and then they don't file an H-1B petition. Yeah, that is a discussion happening, and it's another one where we're just speculating. I mean, there's nothing out there that says there's any employer liability. I think, when we talk about that attestation clause, if there was no intent to sponsor someone through the registration process, I think there's some issues there, but
what about, I mean, so I guess the other end of that, though, the other side of that is, what about, you know, so we have 85,000 spots, 5,000 of those don't come through. What is immigration going to do? Are they going to hold on to all of the extra registrations and then apply those to the 5,000?
Right. So yeah, the flip side of that too is if someone doesn't follow through, does that number sort of go back into the bank? They're saying yes. That if a petition is not, if they have open spots after they go through this initial lottery, that they will calculate the number, and if additional people can be selected, if additional registrations can be selected because there's still open numbers, because people don't follow through or those sorts of things happen, then they will go through a second round. Again, it's sort of all, that's what they say is going to happen, that's what USCIS is telling us. Whether or not that actually happens, if we have a substantial number of people that don't follow through. Generally in the lottery, they actually anticipate a certain percentage of cases will be denied, and so what we're told is they select more than the number of petitions in the lottery than could be, than visas available, anticipating that a certain percentage just won't move forward because they'll be denied. It's kind of anyone's game. We are unfortunately over time, so I will, again, we have just a lot of questions coming in. I really wish that we could answer all of them. We'll try to get to them via email after this webinar. But we do want to thank you for joining this program today. We know that we couldn't provide a lot of concrete information at this time. As you can see during the resources, there is a USCIS webinar for registrants available on February 6th, so that's tomorrow. You can register for that. Hopefully USCIS will be providing some additional information. I know Christine and I will be listening in. There's a separate one for attorneys to provide attorneys information on February 11th. Attorneys meaning attorneys representing sponsoring employers. But for you all, you might consider registering for that webinar. Again, this program has been approved for continuing legal education credit in Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, and Texas, with Wisconsin credit pending. If you need to report your hours in Illinois, Nebraska, Tennessee, or Texas, click on the CLE widget at the bottom of your screen. And remember, this program is also approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. A recording of this webcast will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing. Once available, a link to the recording will be emailed to you along with your certificate in attendance. Please also click on the survey icon at the bottom of your screen to complete our short survey. Your feedback assists us in providing quality future programs. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very, very much.